thing about which there was the most complaint about the 2000 census were people who said, I don't know what I am anymore. I don't know where to put myself. Exactly what you just described.
So how many people wrote in human?
Well, lots of people did, but we recoded them. Let me just say a footnote to this idea of statistical races. That's what a census creates. And the Census Bureau does not care about people. It cares about statistics. And in the statistical record itself, if you're in the statistical record, whatever the questions were asked, whether that's ACS or the decadal or whatever, everybody has every one of the characteristics. I mean, everybody in the, there's no census record of somebody that's not something. Is not 16 instead of 13, or is not a race instead of a non-race or anything else. The statistical system could not handle that.
But if you checked more than one race, what happened to you?
Oh, then we had 63 categories. So we counted all of those categories, and you can go look it up and you can see it. And then we condensed them back. Condensed them back. This is an important question, so let me pause and get it right. You can condense it back as much as you want to, and you can elaborate it as much as you want to, starting from 63 all the way back to 5. The reason that we partly came back to 5 is the Voting Rights Act is managed with the 5 races, not the Hispanic. And then in order to get them, you had to treat them as if they were a race in order to put them into the Voting Rights Act. And that was, it was a messy situation.
So if I'm mixed race, if I'm black and white, I'm counted as black?
Yes. In the Voting Rights Act stuff, when any time there's an issue, if it includes black and white, includes any 2 races, then the race which is conventionally discriminated against is the race that gets that count. We don't, in the Voting Rights Act, we don't sort of measure something called more than one, or mixed race, or whatever it would be, which then really complicates the next stage of this we'll get to shortly. But now where are we? Because the problem is the mixed race was only 2 or 3%. It was easy to absorb and recount people for legal reasons in the court cases.
But now.
Now.
Okay, before we get to 2020, and I want to go back to kind of your moment of revelation. So you entered 2000, it's more ignorance, and now you're running the show. So at what time did you start to feel the disconnect, and why? Well,
when I saw the Mark 1 or more numbers come in and realized that it wasn't going to cause much of a fuss, but I asked myself, well, the pace at which you would expect that to grow would be 4 or 5% per year. With the younger population providing that as kids grew up and they sort of become multiple race by. The one thing that Mark 1 or more has done is it has allowed you more easily to change your race if you want to. I'm partially African American and partially European, and at university I want to be European, so I'm white. But when I'm down and see my great-grandmother in Atlanta, I'm a black. And so we begin to realize people are shifting their races if they wanted to. I'll give you the classic what was Barack Obama, what was his race in the 2010 census?
Black.
Yeah. Is he? Is he black?
I think he identifies as black.
He identified as black.
Does he identify as black or mixed race?
He did. No, he said, he announced that he identified. We don't know how his wife or how the 2 kids were counted, because it's private data, of course. But he decided to make that announcement. Now he had a white mother. He violated the rules of the census. Are we going to recode him? No. Would we recode anybody? Not because he was president, we didn't recode him. The idea of recoding people, once you tick a box about, I put it this way, the racial question on the census is the only attitudinal question on the census. Everything else is objective. You are, well, gender is not more complicated, but that in 2000 one could say that with some more confidence. But age is, you could independently learn somebody's age. You could independently learn their gender. You could independently learn where they lived. Did they rent or own? The very small number of variables there were. You can't independently learn their race, because race is at some level a meaningless concept. Here's how I teach it when I'm talking about race in the classroom. You say, oh, well, here we are. We're at the headwaters of the White Nile, which is Uganda. We're at the headwaters of the Blue Nile, which is Ethiopia. And now we're down where it delivers itself into the Nile, becomes the peninsula, and then moves into the Mediterranean and Alexandria and so forth. Where on that do you draw the line between white and black? Ethiopians and Ugandans seem very dark, but down there in Alexandria, the Egyptians seem fairly white. Where do you draw the line? You can't. Fundamentally, race is what we call a clinal. It's tiny, tiny little changes across a long, you know. So what hit me was that the system isn't really going to work the way we want it to work. And so people say, well, look, I'm black because I can't get a taxi cab. And that is true. But we ought to then penalize the taxi cab system for not picking you up. To put it back into the statistical system for someplace else, it doesn't work so well. So my own hope was that we would do away with I just dislike the word race, as a matter of fact.
I mean, you proposing taking the race question out of the census?
No, no. Many people accuse me of that because that's what it looks like I said. But I've gone back and reread it and wish I'd said it differently. No, I said I want a much more varied data set, all of which can be aggregated back to those 5 categories if somebody wants to aggregate them back. In other words, if you want to count multiple race people as primarily black, you can take all of them and make them black. Or if you want to count the difference between the Chinese and the Taiwanese and the Asians and the Japanese and so forth and so on, as one category, you can count them all as Asian if you want to. So it would have been designed to give the system, academics, Voting Rights Act, maximum flexibility.
What would that question look like?
Oh, the question is the one that we practically have designed for 2020. After the 2010 census, the Census Bureau invested a huge amount of money. It was the biggest single study they've ever done, not just of race, but any single piece of the census. And they came up with, after much pre-testing, 27 different versions of the question and so forth. And they came up with a question that the heading of it is, what is your race, ethnicity, or national origin? So you just mixed up that. So if you want to call yourself Hispanic white, and you want to say, that's my race, or you could say that's my background, or that's my ethnicity, or we don't know, we don't care. That just, you decide what you're going to do. And so the word race gets demoted. Not thrown out, but demoted. And then they also added a new race, completely new race, the MENA race, Middle Eastern North African. And they took the Hispanic question and put it into this bigger question. So the bigger question really does encompass everybody and allows them, and mark more than one. See, the old mark more than one didn't allow for an Hispanic to marry an African American or a European or an Asian or whatever. It allowed you, if you wanted to, that's fine, but you weren't counted as more than one race. You were counted separately as your ethnicity, Hispanic or Latino, and so what we designed in the decade between the 2010 census and the current census was a much more open. For one thing, a lot of write-in spaces. Technically, by the way, we can code this stuff, machine code it very easily, very, very high accuracy record. We know how to do it. We do American tribes that way. They write in the tribe, and we code it pretty easily and call them Cherokee or what have you, and so forth. And we could have done that with the same kind of write-ins. When you get human, or you get I don't know these science fiction words about different kinds of people, and people write that stuff in all the time. Yeah. We recode them, reassign them using very complicated statistical processes for the same reason that you cannot have an empty cell. So I was very enthusiastic about that format. It wasn't exactly what I wanted, but it was pushing in the right direction. It's still, what happens with this is that it is put in the Federal Register and people are invited to critique it. Many critiques came in, but overwhelmingly it was positive, even from the advocacy groups. The Hispanic advocacy groups initially did not want it, and they looked at the data, and it turns out it did not hurt them, it did help them in certain kinds of ways. And so there was and the MENA race, the idea of adding Middle Eastern, North African, that's exactly where there's fussiness about race after all. What I just said about the Nile River and so forth. We were really excited that we're going to have a new, better question. And the Trump administration came to town, and I don't think they did. I just think they didn't think about it. They just buried it. They just ignored it. And the Census Bureau then got in a problem because they had to go out and pre-test their census form in time to get ready for the census and so forth. And if you don't, then it became too late because they would have had to have tested that before they would have wanted to have used it.
So it's not.
So it's not. It never came out of OMB. That's where it went, and it never came out of OMB. My own hope is that if there is a change in administration, it will immediately, after some more testing and so forth, it will go on the American survey, and it'll be much more varied.
And you've argued that we need this change for three primary reasons. Becoming multiracial.
Well, there is racial injustice in this country, and policy has to deal with racial injustice. There is still people who can't live in apartments because they are a color or an identity or an ethnicity or a vocabulary. We know that. And it's less than it was, but it's still there. And as long as there is any kind of discriminatory behavior, exclusionary behavior, which you track back to someone's race, the government has a responsibility to fix it. And so I'm not against getting rid of the question at all, as long as, and I think with respect to the African American population, less the Asian population, and less the Hispanic population, but with respect to the African American population and the American Indian population, that may be a century away. I would think a lot of the melting pot will work increasingly well for the Asian population. We already know the Asian population is moving away from their own Asian origin into the white population.
Some segments.
Some segments, yeah. But enough to change the numbers. And that's what they're going to do. That's what they're going to do. We did not, I can tell you, none of us, certainly in people I talked to and working, none of us expected the white nationalist movement to emerge with such forcefulness. We're still a little unclear about the numbers. The noise level is very high because you got a cheerleader up there, of course, who can make a lot of noise whenever he wants to. But how many of the white population really are nationalist in that sense, that they're really deeply racist, we wish they weren't here, they're all the wrong kind of people, close the gates and so forth, is a harder number to come up with, but sociologists are working on it and so forth. So back to your question, since the census has become a place for expression of identity, and that includes how many of us are there, then it plays that role. Since it still is a tool for doing something about discrimination, it plays that role, and as long as it's playing those two roles, then we keep the question. And whether that's forever, I don't know. But in my own argument, this is now writing well before obviously the arrival of the Trump administration. I really planned it out over generations. You know, the millennial generation is going to be much, much more tolerant of mixed race than their parents and so forth and so on. So every 20 or 30 years, you take another step. But I was simply saying that it's conceivable by the end of the century that we will be colorblind. There was a moment of colorblind conversation associated, of course, with the Obama election. And I'm still living without. It's a long time. And habits do change and so forth, and cultural beliefs change. But the whole race thing itself is a construction. It's not biological, for heaven's sakes. And one of the things I'm concerned about is because of all the DNA stuff and the inheritance of certain kinds of DNA characteristics, that you're getting a creep back of the biological race argument. And that is a bad place to be.
And so how will this question then function in the future? If you're looking in the crystal ball, in the future, how does this question function in the future in which maybe the census is operating more off of the third-party data, the scraping of data,
yeah,
rather than...
One of the things that is very likely to happen going forward, I just said in a smaller group a minute ago, that the 2030 census, I'm now not talking about race, I'm just talking about the general census itself. The 2030 census will look less like the 2020 census than the 2020 census looks like the 1790 census. And what I mean by that is in 1790, the marshals got on their horses, they went around and counted everybody. Today, we don't get on our horses, but we get on our whatever electronic stuff, our internet system, and we count the population and so forth and so on. That greatly simplifies things, but it's the same model. And there are two things happening right now. One of which is the much, much richer capacity to do administrative record data linkage. So the SSA data and the IRS data and the health data and the education data and the transportation data and the housing data can now all become interconnected in a much more richer way, because the data is better because of the whole electronic transformation, big data and so forth. And of course, the big data flows in the United States going forward are not coming out of the federal government. They're coming out of commercial enterprise. They're coming out of your swipe data. They're coming out of your social interaction data. They're coming out of your Facebook data. Your spatial location is known down to the second all the time because we carry these things around and so forth and so on. So there's a ton of data that is being accumulated about this society. And the need for data with fine resolution, geographic, demographic resolution, but also rapidity in order to govern a complicated country like this, and govern it both its economy as well as its society. There's huge pressure to get more timely data. So that I can imagine that by 2030, the census will make heavy use of administrative records and heavy use of third-party data. For example, in this census, not well known, but in this census, all censuses are two censuses. One, there's a census of addresses. You can't do a census unless you have a list of all the addresses. That's your starting point. In 2000, we went around and knocked on doors to find out whether these were residencies or not, as best we could. So you updated it constantly. You didn't knock on every door, but where there was reason to believe you had new developments being built and things being torn down and so forth. This time we did it with Google. We did not knock on doors. Maps. Google Maps, other kinds of surveillance kinds of systems. Which means we live in a surveillance state, and the surveillance state collects a lot of data about us. And most of it is to make money from, that's the commercial data set. But there's no reason we can't reposition it for public good purposes. I say that like, I mean, we can, that doesn't mean it'll be easy to do, but we're already in lots of conversations with the holders of data, because they also want good data. I would put it this way. I think by 2030, the Census Bureau will be more doing data curation than data collection. That is, be looking at different data streams and saying, what's the error structure? And how can we make sure the error structure is high enough to merit or not? Back then to your question, the racial, ethnicity, national origin, whatever the code word is going to be, is not well handled in that new data system. One, it ignores the identity expression. It's independently measured of that. And people are moving themselves in different kinds of racial ways depending on what they're doing. When they're going to school, or when they're in the hospital, or what have you, there's just kind of and for perfectly reasonable reasons. That's their choice. So it's a very fluid process right now, racial measurement altogether. And I do not know how, out of that new model, would you trust Facebook to have a legitimate count of the different races in this country? Now, I'm sure they got one, but I wouldn't have any confidence in it. And it may be years or forever before this facial recognition stuff. Are they going to sort of attach a race to each of those different kinds of facial compositions? They could, but boy, that's room for lots of mischief and so forth. So I don't have an answer to the core question, even as I see other reasons why the census migrates toward other data sets. And then I ask myself, but how do we still maintain a system of racial and social justice in the society when you know that you have to still be alert to that?
So,
yeah,
I mean,
right.
the ability to get this kind of granular data on one hand, I can see how it can be beneficial for public policy, but I think I'm leaning more towards terrifying than beneficial. That
the surveillance system, we know, now gets us into other territory, but I can say it very quickly. We know that this particular census, the 2020 census, starts from a platform that's not true of any previous census. One piece of that platform is political is mistrust of the census at a rate that we have not experienced. We've had people who ignored it, or some people who didn't want to be counted. Always at the edges there's some bit of that. But we now know it's in the 20s and 30s, and for certain kinds of questions it's in the 40% of the population who is really expressing hesitance in that. The citizenship question was part of that and so forth. And the other thing that is not present in our country today is a bipartisan agreement that we want good numbers. We have politicized the census to a point that miscounting and undercounting in certain parts of the country is going to have real political rewards. And I do not think for a second that the Democrats won't take advantage of that as much as the Republicans do. In a highly polarized society, you fight with whatever weapons you got. To turn the census into a political weapon is absolutely unprecedented. It really, really is. And it is disastrous for the census. Because there was a Japanese internment process, as you all know, in the 1940s, based on census data. Not technically violating the letter of the law, but certainly being proactively useful. Every census that gets mentioned, it had a long shadow, long dark shadow, and it still is in play every time you have a census. Oh, don't forget, you did the Japanese internmentship, therefore why should you trust the census? So for the most part, it hasn't had much consequence, but boy, the shadow being left over this census, I just don't see us climbing out from underneath it in the next, in decades is the problem. And I don't know how to think hard. Give me another hour and I'll come up with some better answers. But nevertheless, right now, I don't know how to think hard about what does it mean to govern a country where the data aren't fully believed in. Not just the race data, but the income data, or the health data, or the education, whatever. I don't know what to do about misinformation campaigns. I know what's wrong about them. We've had fantastically good conversations these last 2 days here about data sets and their usefulness of data and how we're using it to do this and accomplish that. It's great stuff. But we all know it's vulnerable to misinformation. So how do you know for sure you're really looking at facts as against non-facts? And the Census Bureau is not immune to all of that.
Well, thank you. We're going to have to actually wrap up, but are there any questions out there? I think we have a little time for questions. That was kind of an ominous note. But I think it is reality. I think those are questions we should be thinking about. I think about it all the time in the work that I do. Does anyone have? Yes?
Yep, right here. I don't remember exactly when. It's been a few years ago. I don't know if it was around around 2000, but there were some very brief conversations about replacing the census with a sample. Can you speak to that? I mean, it was quickly snuffed out and said, no, we've got to have it, and there's lots of reasons to that, but can you please speak to relative advantages, disadvantages?
Yeah. Basically, you could not have a sample of the census because the census itself is the complete count.
Right.
All sample data are then measured against it. You have no way to give weights to sample data to make sure you've taken care of your error structure in the sample data unless you start with a census. That debate, which I won't get into because I had lots of wounds, that's when I was there. Except I did say to the Speaker of the House,
Gingrich.
say it again?
Gingrich.
No, not Gingrich, after him, the wrestler. Hastert. And so later I was having a little argument with him about the sampling issue, and I said, well, just do this for me, please. The next time you go to have a blood test, take it all out. And I mean, this idea that you can't use samples in an intelligent way, the reason that our sample theory works is because we weight it back to the census count. And the census count has got an error structure, but the error structure is simply small enough that we feel very comfortable with that. But that's all you have to do is count with a couple of characteristics. I think one of the things that could happen in the 2030 census is a really stripped down census, decadal census, which maybe only has one or two variables in it. Residency, certainly, you have to have that for apportionment, but maybe age structure or something like that, so you can calibrate back and make sure the other samples are doing it. The statistics on this are getting more sophisticated all the time. Long out, not a very good answer, but I hope it gets close.
Rosemary?
Tina, you talked about 2000 and the whole...
You're about to get a mic. They probably want to...
Thank you. You talked about 2000 and the whole Hispanic question. I still don't know what I am. The more I learn about my genealogy, the more confused I get. My birth certificate says white, and I'm clearly not white. So I just don't ever know what to do. So any movement towards removing race or ethnicity or refining that would be of great compassion to people like me.
You're not alone.
But so that question, is that question still going to be on the 2020?
Oh yeah, the 2020 question will be as it is on the 2010. A few more lines that you can fill in things and so forth. And especially, the problem is the Hispanic, when it got created in the 1960s, it wasn't thought through. A lot of this stuff isn't thought through. As a matter of fact, the huge mistake I made in 2000, for example, is we had an other line. The other line was to catch the multiple race people. Well, we then caught the multiple race people because we said March 1 and 1. We forgot to take the other line off. Literally, forgot. And so we woke up afterwards and said, well, that was dumb because many people had gravitated to the other line when they now had a way to go. And so we said, we're going to take it off. And Congressman said, not on my watch. And he put it into an appropriation bill, and he's on the appropriation committee. That as long as we ask a census, we will keep that other line. It's now not consequential because an awful lot of people don't. People were using it in the Hispanic population was in large numbers because to sort of find a way out of your problem. But anyway, the census is a very, very professional, dedicated, hardworking, wonderful set of actors and processes and so forth and so on. But they are very often underfunded for the census itself. and then they're overfunded to the point where they can maybe spend it in a reasonable way because they waited too late to give them the money. They work under enormous time pressures.